Glasgow got the world talking about climate change and saying that they took climate change seriously. World leaders made pledges, albeit heavily compromised ones, and promises to take action. But with a war in Ukraine and a cost of living crisis diverting attention, two big stories about the state of the climate have actually passed this week without the full attention they deserve. Well, we're going to shine a wee bit of a light on them now, and I'm delighted to be joined by David Shukman, former BBC News science editor. David, good afternoon.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, talk us through these two big stories that have happened this week.
So it's really two sides of the same coin. So on the one hand, we had the Met Office studying the probabilities of what's going to happen in the coming 5 years in terms of the climate. And they've come up with a view that there's a 50-50 chance of one of the next 5 years breaching this apparently crucial 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. Bear in mind that we've probably warmed about 1.1 degrees Celsius already since pre-industrial times. And they reckon that the way things are going, one of the next 5 years, a 50-50 chance that one of them will be at or above that threshold of 150, which is what the Glasgow conference you mentioned was all about trying to avoid, because scientists say the closer you get to 1.5, and certainly if you go above it, which we're heading for at the moment, all kinds of dangers start to follow. So that was on the one side. You had the Met Office study, and then kind of around the same time, The Guardian and some investigative journalists they were working with went through an awful lot of very detailed data about oil and gas companies to try to work out what the implications might be of the projects that these companies have for new oil and gas fields and production facilities and so forth. And they came up with this phrase, a carbon bomb, which sounds very dramatic.
Oh, it does.
Well, it does, doesn't it? They define it as any facility, any project likely to produce 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide over the course of its lifetime. And of course, in the context of Glasgow, back last November, where all the talk was of trying to shift away from fossil fuels as much as possible and as rapidly as possible, with the scientists saying, we've really got to halve carbon emissions by 2030, now only 8 years away, to avoid the worst rises in temperature. To have a study show that there are all of these projects, dozens of them, which are likely to produce huge amounts of the one gas we don't want added to the atmosphere, is in a way pretty depressing and makes it all the likelier that the Met Office study will be proved right, that one of the next 5 years will see a record and may well indeed breach that crucial threshold of 1.5. So fascinating to have these two this week.
Yeah, and as you say, very much linked. And I think you as ever, you explain it so clearly. Two sides of no, it's good because it can be very, there's a lot of information, and if you're not an expert, but you're right, they are exactly, two sides of the same coin. And very, very worrying. I mean, you look at temperatures rising right across the world. I mean, not in the future, right now. And why is it, do you think, David, that we are not keeping our attention on it? Is it because we have got distracted with, very serious other issues? We've just come out of the pandemic. We've got the cost of living crisis. There's the conflict in Ukraine. But does it feel to you like these issues are dropping off the radar a bit?
Well, I think it's inevitable. That I've watched these climate summits every year for the last 20 pretty well. And there's always a whole lot of hype before them. And then an awful lot of global political and media attention on them when they're happening. And a little bit of aftermath for a month or two. And then almost inevitably, some other crisis looms and everybody's attention drifts over there. And I think that's one problem. And then it kind of bounces back. And then sometimes there's a distracting crisis that keeps everybody's eyes off climate for maybe a matter of a few years. And that's definitely happened after the banking crisis. It took a while for attention to refocus on on climate after that. I think in addition, when you've got something as sharp and dramatic and violent as Russia invading Ukraine, that's bound to just suck all the oxygen out of the room in terms of world leaders and their attention spans. And I think that's just bound to have an effect of that kind. And I think in addition, with the cost of living crisis, partly fueled obviously by Putin's actions, it is really interesting, isn't it? Because I think in one way, it could accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels because there's a great willingness, and you see this around the world about, well, actually, we don't want to be sending a big check every week or every month to Vladimir Putin. And one way to avoid doing that is to use less of his coal, oil, and gas. And one way to do that is you can either buy the stuff from elsewhere, and obviously that's happening, or you can try to develop your own resources, and that's also going on with expansion in the North Sea. But the third thing, which I think is really key here, is you just try and use less of it. And the easiest way to do that is to insulate your home, try to go through a whole lot of efficiency measures that just mean you don't burn through so many of these fuels. And I think that's where the climate agenda and the reaction to Putin can kind of align.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really interesting point. David, as ever, a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your